All right, let's dive into a chapter from the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous called There is a Solution. It's a really interesting piece of writing because it lays out this huge, profound problem and then what it presents as an equally profound answer.
Right from the very first sentence, the chapter establishes this collective voice, a we. So you know this isn't just one person's opinion. It's the shared story of thousands of people who saw themselves as completely hopeless, yet somehow found a way to recover.
So who exactly is this we they're talking about? Well, the first part of the chapter really focuses on explaining the nature of this unique group of people.
As the book describes it, this group is, well, it's a total cross-section of society. You've got people from every imaginable walk of life, with all kinds of different beliefs and backgrounds. These are folks who, under normal circumstances, would probably never even meet, let alone become so close.
The book uses this really powerful analogy to explain their bond. It compares them to survivors of a shipwreck. It's that feeling, that shared experience of escaping a disaster together that creates this incredibly strong and immediate connection. It's the cement that binds them.
But, and this is important, the book is very clear that the shared problem isn't even the main thing. The real power, the thing that truly unites everyone, is that they found a common solution, something they can all agree on and, more importantly, act on. That's the good news they're trying to share.
Okay, so before we get to that solution, the text insists that you have to have a really clear understanding of the problem itself, and it's framed as a very, very particular kind of illness. Now, this is a crucial point they make. This condition isn't seen as some kind of weakness of character or a moral feeling. As the book puts it, we have come to believe it an illness, and it's an illness with this unique destructive power to just engulf everyone connected to the person who has it. To really illustrate how different it is, the text draws a pretty stark comparison. Think about an illness like cancer. The typical reaction from people is sympathy, right? But with alcoholism, the reaction is often misunderstanding, anger, and just fierce resentment. It creates this level of social and family destruction that's really unique.
So this brings us right to the central puzzle that the book tries to unpack, the thinking, the mindset of what it calls the real alcoholic.
This is a question so many people ask, and it's a genuine one. If you're a moderate drinker, or even a pretty heavy drinker, you can probably stop if you have a good enough reason. So the question becomes, why can't this other person do the same? And here's where the text makes a critical distinction. A hard drinker might be doing real damage to themselves, but they can often stop or at least cut way back if the stakes get high enough. The real alcoholic, on the other hand, gets to a point where taking just one drink means they lose all control over how much they have. They become, as the book says, a completely different person, a real Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
So the book argues that the physical part, the body's reaction after you start drinking, that's only half the story. The real problem, the thing that gets the whole cycle going in the first place, is the mental state that makes them take that first drink to begin with.
And this mental piece leads us to the most dire aspect of the problem that's described in this chapter, the total breakdown of willpower. This is a really baffling concept, and the book says it's baffling even to the alcoholic themselves. They might give you 100 different excuses for why they started drinking, but deep down, they don't really know why. The book calls it a mental obsession that just defies any kind of rational explanation.
And here it is. This is the fundamental assertion of the entire chapter. For reasons the authors freely admit are not fully understood, a line gets crossed. And at that point, the ability to choose whether or not to take that first drink is just gone. Willpower, as most of us think of it, simply doesn't exist for them in that moment.
This powerlessness is described as being absolute. In their own words, we are without defense against the first drink. Think about that. Even the fresh, painful memory of all the humiliation and suffering isn't enough to stop it. The mind just finds a way to push those thoughts aside and entertain that old idea that this time it'll be different.
So after painting this incredibly bleak picture of a person who is completely trapped by this mental obsession, the chapter makes a sudden, sharp pivot. It turns to the solution. Right after describing what sounds like a completely hopeless condition, these 4 simple words appear on the page. Despite the loss of control, despite the mental blank spots, and despite the total powerlessness, the text states plainly, there is a way out. The solution is presented as a very practical set of actions, what they call a simple kit of spiritual tools. This isn't a passive thing. It requires some really rigorous self-examination, a whole lot of humility, and being completely honest about your own faults.
And the result of using these tools is described as a profound internal shift. This is what they call the great fact. For every one of them, they've had these deep and effective spiritual experiences. And these experiences, the text says, completely revolutionize their entire attitude toward life, their relationships, everything.
Now, to really support this claim, the chapter wraps up with a very powerful story that involves a highly respected doctor.
The story is about this successful businessman who had every advantage you can imagine: money, success, access to the best psychiatric minds of the day, including the famous Dr. Carl Jung, and yet nothing worked. He always went back to drinking.
So, completely defeated, the man goes back to his doctor and asks for the cold, hard truth. The doctor tells him his case is hopeless from a medical and psychiatric perspective. And in his desperation, the man asks if there is any hope at all for anyone like him.
And this is the doctor's answer. He says that yes, the only exceptions he's ever seen are people who have had what he calls vital spiritual experiences. He describes them as these huge emotional rearrangements, something science couldn't create, but something he had seen with his own eyes. The chapter concludes by explaining the whole purpose behind sharing these deeply personal, often painful stories. They say that we believe it's only by being this open about ourselves and our problems that another person who feels just as hopeless will finally be persuaded to look at them and say, yes, I am one of them too. I must have this thing.